I am absolutely delighted to introduce Alba today. Alba is currently a postdoc fellow at the University of Copenhagen at the Centre for Subjectivity Research. She is affiliated with a project about antagonistic political emotions. Some of us had the pleasure of hearing Alba speak at an inter-centre meeting at STU, and I thought this was a wonderfully relevant project for many people, and I was just so taken with some of the ideas that Alba presented that I'm really, really delighted that you came to give us more insight into your project here today. Would you prefer questions as you go or at the end?
I'm used to at the end, but we can, I don't know, I think if something like arises that is, we can, have some in between if you prefer,
so that
flexible that way.
Super, wonderful. So we have a couple of people joining us online as well, and we'll also be able to take questions from people online too. I'll manage that for you at the end.
Great.
About 45 minutes and then questions after that.
Okay,
super.
Perfect.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that should be okay.
Let's go a few minutes over. I'll give you a sign anyway. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much, Alba. We look forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have been really looking forward, and I hope I hope this is This is the beginning of a project. I'm a philosopher embarking in a project that is now going to have a qualitative research component. I haven't done this before. I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around how to do that, and I really look forward to your feedback. It's just the initial stages of the process. So the talk today, I'm going to give you a couple of words about the research context. Then I'm going to get into the topic of the emotional impact of migration, relocation. So here what I'm looking at, what I'm interested in is, what happens So the reason why I have this slash is that some people have gotten confused when I talk about migrants, and then I'll tell you what my target population is, and So it's just moving abroad, living abroad from the place where you were born and you were raised, and it doesn't imply any, dramatic stories of having to cross the Strait of Gibraltar in horrible conditions and so on. I'm going to talk about the sense of belonging, which I think it's a very important notion to understand these processes, and that's what my focus is going to be throughout the project, how relocation unsettles belonging, and then just a wrap up. So to begin with, as Christine told you, at the moment I'm affiliated with the Center for Subjectivity Research. I'm working with Szanto, who is also a philosopher who's done a lot of work on emotion, phenomenology of emotion, and very interested in the politically relevant emotions and how emotions play out in the political domain. And he's done some work on the sense of belonging, and what I'm currently working on is more this theoretical side of things with Thomas on how to conceptualize and how to think about belonging as a phenomenological notion, as how one experiences belonging to a group or to a culture. But the bigger project is a 5-year project that's just been funded, that is going to take place in Spain. I'm going to be between the two places. And it's called Belonging Reconfigured, a phenomenological study of migrant emotions and social identity change in a sample of Spanish expats. And it's going to involve what Simon Höften and Christian Martini have termed phenomenological interviews to explore the experiences of people Spaniards who have been living in Scandinavia for a while, and how their feelings of belonging have changed and shifted and so on throughout the process. And I have funding to hire a PhD student, so if you think you know someone who might be interested, they have to speak Spanish to do the interviews, but So that's the context, right? How it's going to take place. So the main focus is this emotional impact of relocation, right? I've been looking at the way this has been researched in psychology, especially in the psychology of migration. And there are two notions that are important here, or two bodies of research that take care of how migration impacts people emotionally. One focuses on acculturative stress, the impact of moving to a new society and having to adapt. And the other body of research focuses on migratory grief, on this mourning the loss of home and familiar surroundings. So to go a little bit more in detail into each of them, the notion of acculturative stress is coming mainly from research into social psychology. It's a part of acculturation theory, so looking at how individuals integrate into a new culture. It's very much sort of a group, sort of host society perspective on the process, and that's where the gist of it is coming from, right? The whole approach is focused on the challenges of learning or adjusting or learning new cultural codes, new practices, how one does things here in this new environment. And the subject, the migrant or the expat or the person who's relocating is conceived as a newcomer who's trying to adjust. The whole thing has this forward-looking perspective. There's this goal that I want to, become better and integrate into this new reality, and it looks mostly at the initial stages of the process, right? Of course, in that context, so they take care of the notion acculturation in general, how the process of acculturation in general. They talk about acculturative stress as a product of this effort of learning, of trying, of failing, and so on and so forth. And of course, stress, like all other forms of stress, can have this more motivating role, but it can become problematic in certain situations, be overwhelming, cause anxiety, cause, other problems. So if you think about the emotional impact and the emotion words and phenomena that are at play here, a lot of it concern belonging. They are connected to this goal of belonging, this feeling as an outsider, aspiring to become better integrated, to be read as, belonging in certain sense. And it's more feelings of loneliness, of I lack meaningful connections, how do I establish them, and so on. Okay, so this is it. And before I move on, I just wanted to mention that the approach has been criticized because initially the assumption was made, as I was telling you, is very much sort of host society focused. The assumption was, and a lot of the picture seems to imply that assimilation is an ideal, so sort of that you have to give up who you were before and change and become someone different so that you can become an in-group. And so there was this idea that, this is what migrants are trying to do. They're trying to become one of the new group. And in fact, the picture is a lot more complex than this. It's very, it's actually not what many migrants are trying to do when one is trying to integrate in some way, but one is not trying to leave something behind and become, it's not, either or, yeah.
Would you say that's how most institutions see migration?
I think this is a hunch. I think so, but I cannot back it up with having done any research on institutional culture and so on. But I think it's my impression of a lot of public discourse on migration is that the way things are conceived are as these people have to leave behind and become one of us, and really and a lot of language policy, and it varies a lot in different countries, right? But a lot of the problems one sees with bilingualism and so on, they hinge on these wrong conceptions that you have to sort of shift as either or, and it's very either you're in group here or in group there, and there's not really room for complexity in the discourse for something that's a bit more nuanced. But I mean, this is just my yeah, I wouldn't sort of sign that. Like, I've done research and I can give you data on that. Right. But this is a criticism that was raised against some of the initial work on acculturation theory, that it was very sort of one-sided and had this preconception that there was an ideal of assimilation that was very monolithic. Okay, so migratory grief is the other big, I don't know if to call it paradigm, but sort of body of research on emotional impact of migration. And this is coming from a very, very different place. So a lot of the work is inspired by psychoanalytic clinical practice. So it starts from practitioners that are not thinking about, they need to treat migrants because this is a problem, and they find this in the therapy room, right? They find that these issues arise there. So they start investigating them. And just as a clarification for you and also for me, this was kind of part of my process of reading into these things. Migratory grief is very different from nostalgia, at least from the way nostalgia is conceived in psychology these days. So this is not nostalgia research. In this body of research, which is it's been thriving for a number of years now, nostalgia is conceived as a bittersweet feeling of longing for the past that arises in all of us. Of course, it's not confined, circumscribed to someone who moved abroad and misses home, but it's, I don't know, about childhood memories. There's a lot of the stories that they've gathered that have to do with, I don't know, the things I played with when I was a child, Proust and his Madeleine, right, with that kind of thing, right, the cakes my grandmother baked, and so on and so forth. And there isn't a clear-cut distinction made with homesickness, although there is some indications that, well, it's broader than that. Homesickness, perhaps some homesickness is part of nostalgia, but it's a very different phenomenon if you look at migratory grief. So homesickness is specifically this thing about missing home when you're not there. It has this place element to it. And in the migratory grief paradigm, homesickness is understood as a form of grief. And a form of grief initially in the psychoanalytic way of thinking about grief, and you don't have to buy into the psychoanalytic paradigm of grief. There are many psychologists who use it as a way of thinking about what happens when people have been abroad for a long time. So this is not nostalgia. This is grief. This is a form of grief that is different from grief for a loved one who's lost. It has some peculiarities. Grief for someone who dies is a lot more final. You have a crisis and you have to readjust. Here you have multiple recurrent processes of mourning. Multiple because you don't mourn one, there's not one thing you lose, and recurrent because you come back and things pop up again and so on, right? And here the subject is conceived as an expatriate, and when I say expatriate, what I mean is someone who's not in the country of origin, mourning various losses. So it's backward looking, it's about the past. And interestingly, this is not from research, but I listened to an interview with a therapist, a psychologist who specializes in therapy with migrants, who says that they typically see people coming with these issues after 5 to 7 years of being abroad. People don't come with migratory grief issues when they've been abroad for a year, typically. I mean, this is one therapist, saying what she sees in the practice, so it might vary a lot depending on the population you're working with and so on. So as I was saying, they conceive the losses as multiple, and this is from the work of Joseba Chotegui, who's a Spanish psychiatrist who works. He works with migrants in very difficult situations in the Barcelona region with people who've, either from Africa across the strait or people who've come illegally from Latin America and have, all kinds of other health problems. And then there is a psychiatric unit where he works, and he talks about 7 losses. I say this because the 7th is very specific, I think, to certain groups of migrants, right? So the first is family and loved ones, language, culture, homeland. Here, a lot is about place in the sense of not so much of nation, an idea of nation, but, missing the landscape, the smells, the light, that kind of thing. The 5th is social status. Of course, many of the people in the populations he studies really lose a lot of status. And then frequent contact with one's ethnic group, and the physical and bodily safety that, of course, in that case, in the case of his population, is very salient. Perhaps in more privileged populations, like many of us are, it's just tiny, subtle things about miscommunication with your doctor or something like that, potentially, but it's not really so relevant. But note that 1 to 6 are all connected to belonging in one way or another, to belonging to culture, to feeling at home, that kind of things. So what are the issues or the questions that I have with these 2 ways of thinking about the emotional impact of migration? Well, the first big question is, how do these 2 phenomena relate? The 2 bodies of research, they're not really talking to each other. It's not that they're blind to the fact that there are challenges in these 2 directions, but there's really no dialogue. And an initial idea one could have is that perhaps they don't do that because the 2 things don't happen at the same time, right? There's a temporal sequence here. So first one has acculturation stress, then one reaches the integration stage, and then is when it hits you that you've lost something, that you've changed, become someone else, in group somewhere else, something like this, and then migratory grief strikes. I think things are a lot more nuanced than this. And I think we need to look, and that is my aim, is to look at the common denominator, which is a challenged sense of belonging. I don't think there's enough, the way to connect the 2 bodies of research and to make more sense of the nuances would be to just look at both phenomena as effects of different impacts that the process has on the sense of belonging and how it readjusts. So, sense of belonging, we come to the question, right? So first, there are several notions one can, that are relevant in this context. Just to sort of clarify, of course, there is an objective or an institutional sense of belonging. There is a lot of work done on this in literature on migration, on politics, border policing, citizenship, rights, and all that stuff. Of course, institutional factors and objective facts about whether your membership is recognized or not, whether you have access to it or not, do impact psychologically and your experience, but this is not the focus of my project. This is geographers, political theorists, and so on. That's not what I'm going to be focusing on. So I come from philosophy of emotions, phenomenology, so what I'm going to be studying is belonging in this subjective experiential sense. What does it mean to feel you belong or don't belong? And there are at least 2 facets that are distinguished in the literature. One is place belongingness, which has to do with more this idea of home, feeling at home in a place, a sense of rootedness. And then another sense would be specifically the social, the group belonging, the feeling accepted and valued, and feeling a sense of a we, that you're part of a we with other people. And what I'm starting to look at the moment is the sense of group belonging, partially also because of where I come from. I have looked into social emotions, shame, pride, and so on. And my colleague Thomas is looking at group phenomena, group emotions, and so on. So this is where things are starting. And So in contemporary phenomenology, I have chosen here to focus on two different conceptualizations. One is my colleague Thomas's idea that belonging can be conceived as an episodic feeling or an emotion. With episodic, just something you feel like other emotions, I don't know, fear, shame, and so on. And there's a different conceptualization as a background existential feeling of being one of us. So how do they differ, and what are the characteristics? So first, belonging as an episodic feeling akin to other standard emotions. So here Thomas Szanto, he uses a distinction or an analysis of feelings of belonging in a way that we typically analyze the structure or the structure of emotional experiences in philosophy of emotions. So we say that emotions have a target, they are about something, their experiences of something in the world, they are about something, that's a target object. They have a formal object, and formal object just simply means they evaluate whatever they're about in a specific way, right? So fear evaluates its object, the charging bull, incoming exam that you haven't prepared for, as something dangerous or threatening for you. Formal object of fear is threat or danger. That's simply, the characteristic evaluation that characterizes each emotion and allows you to distinguish it from the other, right? The formal object of anger is offensive. This thing is offensive to me. For example, of course, there are always controversies about how exactly to define it, and then the focus is a background object that you care about, that the subject cares about, that makes it intelligible why you're emoting in this way. If you don't care about the stuff that is in front of you, you just don't emote, you don't respond emotionally. That's just the intuition. And that in every emotion there is this focus of concern that is what makes you emote and evaluate this thing in this particular way. So Thomas thinks that we can analyze the feeling of belonging as an episodic emotion with these three elements. So the intentional target here would be the subject's relation to the group. So think belonging, an emotion, right? The target, what it is about, is not the group itself. It is the relation you have to the group. I am, sort of fit in here, right? So it's not just about the group itself, it's about your relationship to the group. That's what gets evaluated. The formal object that characterizes belonging would be this positive congruence. So I fit in with them, I am similar enough, I share certain commonalities, and this feels good, right? This is there has some positive quality. And the focus here would be precisely that you want to be valued, you want to fit in, you want to be recognized and accepted as one of us, right? Because you care about being accepted, when you feel that this is happening, you feel good about it, right? So that's Thomas's analysis. And I have an example that doesn't really relate directly to the migration issues, but I think illustrates how one can think about belonging in this episodic way. And it's an anecdote from a long time ago. In 2004, I happened to be a trainee in Germany in a very, very, very institutional, international place, right? Everyone there was from different countries in Europe. And on the 11th of March of 2004, in Madrid, which is the city where I come from, where I grew up, where I spent most of my life still, there was this terrible terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda, where two regional trains that were entering into the main train station in the center of the city, they were blown up by suicide bombers. There were more than 200 people killed, there were almost 2,000 injured, the city was in complete chaos, and it was really, it was one of the post 9/11 big terrorist attacks in Europe. And it was really traumatic. I mean, the whole atmosphere of the city changed for a couple of months after this happened. And I wasn't in Madrid. I was in Frankfurt in this super international environment. And I remember very, very clearly, of course I had other Spanish colleagues, we shared this concern, we shared this, but I remember clearly walking into the canteen in this group of people where some of them, some specific ones of them, were looking distressed in a specific way. Everyone else wasn't. I don't know if I'm right about this, but I think I could pick out the Spaniards in the crowd. I had never met them before. I didn't know if they were Spanish or Greek or Italian or whatever. We looked at each other, and there was a certain, you know exactly how I'm feeling, kind of, this is, all these other guys, they have no, they know, they're looking at the news, they probably think it's concerning and so on. They don't care about it in the same way, right? There was some kind of special thing going on there, and feeling that, okay, I'm not alone in this. There's others out there in the crowd that actually share this. And I interpret these moments of, crossing a look with a complete stranger as episodic feelings of we belong together. We know what it's like at the moment. We can, of course, debate about this. It's a quite complex example, but I thought I'll just bring it into the table. So, how does this help to, or what are the limitations for my issue about the emotional impact of migration? Well, perhaps one of the most obvious is that in a migrant experience, the most salient are feelings of not belonging, not this belonging and connection with the other that I just described. So maybe we would need an account of the episodic feeling of being a stranger or something like that. I'm not sure, but this is really a question for this possibility. Another aspect of this is that in everyday lives, these episodic feelings often are absent, but if you talk to people, many migrants and expats would tell you that they feel they don't really belong where they are. There's a sense in which they don't, and it's not that they're all constantly having, some clear emotional experience, emotional episodes in this sense. And the phenomenon becomes salient as an absence of something that seems to have been there before migrating in the background inconspicuously without you even noticing it was there. So it seems that something else might be at stake here. And here, the account of belonging as an existential feeling might help. Because Matthew Ratcliffe has a number of years ago characterized existential feelings as background affective orientations that shape your space of possibilities in this pre-reflective background way. So they're not, you're not aware of an emotion, but it's sort of a general coloring of your experience that opens certain possibilities of perception, of emotion, of that are not open, or that sort of skews your emotional landscape in a specific way. And recently, Lillian Wilde has written an article. Here she's looking at actually at psychopathology, not at migration. But she talks specifically about the sense of belonging as something that gets disrupted in some conditions. And she conceptualizes as a sense of unification, or of being one of us, along the lines of phenomenologist Gerda Walter. So she calls it an affective, pre-reflective, habitual feeling of experiencing others as significantly similar to oneself, and the world as a meaningfully shared space. So to unpack this a little more, so the feeling, belonging has this affective nature. There is no cognitive positing necessary. You don't have to be able to think or conceptualize yourself as a member of the group, but it's rather some pre-reflective feeling of having a special kind of connection which only becomes focal when it breaks down. It has an habitual nature, so you don't need to be always in contact with others for that background feeling to be at play. So the way she's thinking about it is as a sedimented feeling, right? Through experiences of sharing things, sharing emotions, sharing experiences with others, you sort of habitualize the other, internalize, or sort of assume that there are these others out there that are available to share experiences with you. And that shapes your experience even when they are not present. That is the idea. And specifically, following Wilde, she claims that others are experienced as humans who also. And this who also is pretty open. So humans who are similar to oneself in significant ways doesn't have to be necessarily, culturally or. She leaves it very, very open, Wilde, because she's not talking specific about anything, any group in particular, but about what does it mean to feel belonging to a group, to feel belonging to others. So in one circumstance, it might be, I don't know, humans who also like to play chess. Of course, this is very, very, very thin. So in the case of migration, it would be more robust cultural background practices and so on. And in virtue of that, the world emerges is given as a meaningfully shared space. So I have a background sense of experiencing the world as others experience it too. Now, this seems to take care of some of the problems that I raised before about precisely this is a habitual thing that only becomes visible when it breaks down. It wasn't conspicuous when it was working. Now that it's not working, I experience that something is wrong. But there are a few other sort of questions here. So Wilde in the article is seeking to understand disruptions in mental illness, where there is a generalized feeling of not being understood by anyone, of sort of there's something that separates me from social interaction in subtle ways. Sometimes they talk about looking at others and at social interactions as if from behind a glass that isolates me from them. And in processes of migration, it seems that the disturbance is more localized and more specific. It relates to a specific group and not to human interactions in general, right? Seems to be I have an obstacle here, but there, no. It's perhaps more localized than her account. We need to make it a bit more specific, more granular. And the disruption in migration, I'm not sure about this, but perhaps at the beginning is more easily perceived as temporarily circumscribed. I am experiencing difficulties now, but potentially they will improve or go away. I'm not sure this is the case in psychopathology. I don't know enough about that, but this is a question in my mind. And of course, I have said I wasn't going to look at this in particular in this talk, but of course, for the wider project, I think specifically place is going to play a much larger role than it plays in her account of belonging. Perhaps what needs to be done here simply is to talk about different areas or different structures that might get disrupted, not just about one thing. Maybe belonging is more than one structure or more than one feeling or something like that. I don't know how we're doing for time because... Okay, fine, and then I think I can get through the whole thing. So to make sense of how belonging is impacted in these processes, I think we need to combine and refine both accounts, perhaps probably expand as well. And so how does relocation unsettle belonging? Here I should say from the start that I am assuming that to begin with, belonging was unproblematic. This, of course, is not always true. There are many people who, for whichever reason, for many various reasons, they already felt that they didn't belong where they came from, or that there was something difficult there. Perhaps they were discriminated against in one way or another. Perhaps they have problematic relations with family. I mean, so the concept of home, feeling at home, feeling one belongs, often is already problematic from the start. And the picture I'm going to give you is like a very coarse before and after. Before, everything was inconspicuous and belonging was perfect, and after is disrupted. But obviously not all the time things are like that, and I'm sure that I'm going to find stories of people who migrated precisely because their sense of belonging in the first place was problematic, and they wanted to go away from that, right? So just a disclaimer here that things are often much more complicated. But assuming that there was a stage at which these problems didn't arise or belonging wasn't problematic, what happens in acculturation, here I'm taking my cue from Alfred Schutz, who wrote a phenomenological sociologist who looked at this phenomenon of the stranger adjusting to a new society. So he talks about tacit structures of habitual knowledge that are working for the in-group, that are not very logical, that are simply things that is just how things are done here, that practically work, but then they're not very easy to understand because they're not necessarily, very well organized or consistent. And the in-group has some of those, and the stranger comes with some new ones. And so their tacit knowledge about how we do things, how it works, how we approach others, all of this becomes unreliable. One is no longer in a place where one can rely on tacit knowledge because all of those things are different, or at least sufficiently different that there is some glitches. And then all of these structures that up to now have been invisible and effortless, they become visible and they require effort. I have to question and ask why and how about every little thing, about maybe not every little thing, but many little things that I used to take for granted in the place where I come from. Other people typically, they don't know which bits of information you need because they are in the in-group, in the tacit knowledge that is invisible for them, they rely on, that is practical, that is part of what structures their interactions. And they're not conscious that of everything that a newcomer might need. They don't also know your tacit knowledge from wherever it is you come from. So there aren't enough commonalities to always effortlessly experience others as humans who also, and in fact in some circumstances other people are precisely humans who don't do the things in the way I am used to doing them. Right? So the background existential feeling is disrupted in all of these ways. And now if you're talking about grief, if you're talking about why one experiences grief and how is belonging unsettled in a way that grief arises, you have a very similar picture, right? So when you're coming back, you have started to internalize new small habits, perhaps not at the very beginning, but after a while, right? So sometimes, and you haven't been in touch with the dynamic context back home, which keeps evolving in ways that are not always obvious to those that are immersed in it. So your tacit habitual knowledge, which is frozen at the time when you left, more or less, is no longer up to date, and therefore it's also slightly unreliable. You expect to find exactly the same, and things are not exactly the same. So again, what was invisible and effortless becomes visible and requires a bit of effort. Maybe not as much as adjusting to the new place, but yes, some. And it's particularly nagging for some people because precisely you assume that you shouldn't be experiencing these things and still you are. And of course, again, others typically don't even realize that you perhaps might need updating on certain habits, on certain things, I don't know, jokes, whatever it is. So there, sometimes a question arises whether there is still enough common ground for a sense of us. The fitting in is not effortless, and in some cases group identity is thrown into question and sometimes even gets lost. If you hear stories from people who have spent most of their lives in a different country, they tell you things like, I don't belong anywhere, I don't know where I belong, and I'm a foreigner back home and I'm a foreigner in the other country, I'm not in group anywhere anymore. So this is typically something that you hear, I think, with these people who've been away for a really, really long time, but it can happen because of that out of sync with a dynamic context that keeps changing. So in both cases, the existential feeling has been altered, and one no longer feels that others are largely what oneself, at least not all of the time, or that the entire space is effortlessly shared. This shapes your space of possibilities in an everyday way. But of course, one keeps caring about fitting in and being valued, while the danger of mismatches between you and the group is higher. So perhaps, feelings of not belonging, loneliness and nostalgia and so on, they arise more often, like episodically, like these conspicuous emotional experiences. But these episodic feelings, they arise against the backdrop of the altered existential feeling that makes them, changes their character and makes them more frequent and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that's basically where I am at the moment. So to sum up, acculturation theory and migratory grief theory study the emotional impact of migration in isolation from each other. But both phenomena, I believe, have a common root in challenged feelings of belonging. The feelings of group belonging specifically have been analyzed as either episodic feelings or existential feelings. And my idea right now is that challenge existential feelings are the common root of these phenomena, acculturation, stress, and migratory grief. And the episodic feelings of not belonging or strangeness arise against this backdrop. So thanks all of you for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion.